Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gábor Csepregi. I will be the moderator for this afternoon event on education and common sense. Dr. Roberts, he's on his way, as I was told. So we will begin the session with a keynote address by John O'Sullivan, President of Danube Institute. Mr. O'Sullivan.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been asked to make a few introductory remarks on education. What I'll do is first suggest that a conservative education policy should be designed to preserve and strengthen what we used to call a liberal education, and then ask what the purposes of a liberal education are, and finally to examine briefly the threats to such an education throughout the Western world. Well, having laid out a few ideas on that, I will leave to my distinguished colleagues the hard task of proposing remedies. First, therefore, what are the purposes of a liberal education at all levels, but especially at the university level? Let me suggest they boil down to four aims. The first is the disinterested search for truth. That's ultimately why universities exist. This is obvious, of course, and not in itself a subject of controversy, but matters don't end quite there. Only a relatively small number of students possess either the passion or talent to be genuine scholars for life. Modern society, with its egalitarian ethos, is reluctant to accept that limitation and seeks to direct more students into scholarly work than are suited to it. And that has several bad effects on scholarship itself. It leads to the overproduction of research, often mediocre or pointless research undertaken for the sake of gaining tenure, research that adds little to the sum of human knowledge other than cynical jokes about research making common sense redundant. It leads to the creation of college disciplines that are largely dissociated from anything like a disinterested search for truth, and that soon morph into essentially propagandistic activities in which only one side of an argument is permitted and dissenters from that side excluded and marginalized. Many departments of women's studies and of black studies are of this nature, some quite explicitly so. And because disinterested research sometimes establishes facts or provisional scientific truths that conflict with ideologies strong in the academy, this leads to the drift of scholarship towards a postmodern denial of truth and its replacement with the notion of different but equal scholarly perspectives and narratives. In this arena, for example, in critical legal theory, power has replaced truth as the prevailing object of inquiry. At best, that kind of thing is a form of intellectual entertainment. When Jacques Derrida died, for instance, the satirical magazine The Onion ran the headline, Jacques Derrida dies. This suggests powerfully that the general social value of such scholarship is extremely limited. Maybe it should be financed on the medieval method. That is to say, itinerant scholars would receive fees from their students on a lecture-by-lecture basis. The second purpose of education is that it should prepare its graduates for the world of work, either giving them a specific body of knowledge required to practice some particular occupation, law or accountancy, say, or instilling in them a good general education, the 3 R's in the old phrase, that would fit them for all kinds of possible occupations. This purpose should ideally inform all levels of education, not simply the university. But again, it seems especially relevant to the university. And the university does not seem to be doing the job we expect from it. Too many graduates leave college with quite inadequate general skills, even down to the point of being able to write a literate and comprehensible letter. Yes, I'm aware that colleges complain their students arrive from high schools lacking the skills that secondary education would normally give them. In the US, in Britain, and in some European countries, many of our high schools betray their pupils, especially their poor and minority pupils, by the quality of education they provide. Those who argue that this is a civil rights issue are not far from wrong. But it does not absolve colleges from remedying the low academic skills of their new entrants. Once a university accepts a student, it makes a promise to educate him or her to the level that the world expects. As for the acquisition of skills relevant to a particular job, one sign that colleges may be doing an inadequate job is the large increase in recent decades in the number of students going on to study for PhDs or in law schools. This indicates that postgraduate education is now often being asked to do some of the work that undergraduate schools used to perform. A PhD should not be regarded as a necessary credential for most jobs outside the academy and certain specialized scientific occupations, nor should law schools function as intellectual finishing schools. One of the reasons that produces this situation may be the expansion of student numbers in the last two generations in the West. Kingsley Amis, who was a Cambridge Don in English as well as a well-known novelist, opposed this expansion at the time with the memorable phrase, "more will mean worse." When he came under attack for elitism, he explained that an increase in student numbers would adversely affect the quality of education because it would mean a teacher was less able to take for granted a high level of knowledge on the part of students, and he would therefore have to explain much more as he went along. It seems reasonable also to believe that the more students are admitted to university, the lower the average academic ability will be. Other things being equal, the quality of education will decline. Such arguments have been ignored, however, during the period of university expansion that has taken place, as I say, in the last two generations of students. That expansion took two forms. First, there was a general increase in the total number of students, and secondly, preference systems were gradually introduced to increase the number of students from particular social groups in specific disciplines. My increasingly firm conclusion is that in neither case has this led to beneficial results. Increasing the number of students without increasing the number of high-quality jobs to which degree led almost automatically in the past, when student numbers were lower, is a recipe for widespread social disappointment. It will swell the size of an unemployable and resentful intelligentsia, or perhaps lumpen intelligentsia, which, as the distinguished historian Robert Conquest pointed out in his book Reflections on a Ravaged Century, that the creation of such an lumpen intelligentsia was a major cause of instability in Russia, on Tsarism, and in the Middle East in the 20th century. In the second case, quotas and/or preferences, these systematically mismatch members of the selected groups supposed to benefit from them with the intellectual competition of students entering high-quality schools on merit. Some of the most potentially successful Black and Hispanic lawyers in the top 10% of the ability range in the United States will never practice law because finding themselves matched against the top 1% of other groups in Ivy League colleges, they become discouraged and drop out. In both cases, dropouts and graduates, they become convinced that the system is stacked against them, that they are victims of discrimination either at college or in employment later. In a sense, they are right, but not in the sense they mean. Finally, the likelihood that a graduate will find a job market after college either unwelcoming or even closed is maximized if he has graduated in subjects that make employers doubt his usefulness. This might simply be because the subject teaches hostility to business and its values, or simply because it seems irrelevant to the world of work. Cultural studies, for instance, might be thought to fail on both scores. The third aim of a liberal education has traditionally meant to produce a well-rounded, civilized person capable of being, in turn, a wise counselor, a trustworthy friend, an astute judge of public matters, a cultivated aficionado of the arts, and an amusing dinner party companion. That education produces such paragons has been one of the standard justifications for government financing it. The argument being that a society composed of people like this would be better all round, but in particular, both better governed and better easier to govern. It is hard to justify that justification, however, because in the confusion and upending of values that have been gathering speed since the First World War, there is no longer general agreement on either on social values or on the ideal social type who embodies them. That ideal used to be the idea of the gentleman, and that is in most respects a liberal ideal. A gentleman is someone with a confident sense of himself and a willingness to respect others until they disillusion him, whose skills and values make him, enable him to navigate the currents of a free and changing society independently. The gentleman is the topic of a study by the distinguished Anglo-American political theorist, the late Shirley Robin Letwin. Her book, The Gentleman in the Novels of Trollope, repays study. And it is no accident that Mrs. Letwin was also the author of a distinguished study of Thatcherism that saw the distinctive quality of Thatcherite conservatism as being the fostering of the vigorous virtues. But the gentlemanly virtues today are denounced as inauthentic, snobbish, tending towards inequality, and a bad social model, therefore, by those who believe in a less disciplined and orderly society, and who find the self-discipline required of a gentleman constricting and stuffy. It will be hard to revive a virtue-based ideal, an educational discipline, until we reach greater agreement on what the social virtues are and should be today. Even if one accepts that education is and should be the forcing house of such social virtues, however, that does not necessarily justify state education as opposed to other bases of education. Indeed, the great period in Britain when such virtues were, I hesitate to use the phrase, when such virtues were mass-produced, was in the 60 years from mid-Victorian England to the First World War. In his important book, The Strange Death of Moral Britain, the late Christy Davies establishes that the fall in almost all the social vices, crime, drunkenness, illegitimacy, disorder, and the rise of respectability, friendly societies, Sunday schools, church attendance, were both well in train before the rise of state education. Probably the peak of Victorian self-control and the triumph of the gentlemanly ideal, as I say, indeed, the mass production of gentlemen, was the 1880s, well before state education had a solid foundation in Britain. I think it's clear today that such a genuinely virtue-based approach, one against heavy odds, obviously, is found more in charter schools, in religious schools, in homeschooling, and in some private schools than in state schools, and in those schools where the curriculum is dominated by teachers' unions, now almost universally in progressive hands. The fourth purpose of education is to transmit the values, traditions, and customs of a society to the next generation. That is something with which the great classical liberals have felt uncomfortable, and not without reason. John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer, in particular, were concerned that a single state education would in effect impose a conformity upon society that was dull, likely to obstruct truth and prolong error, and ultimately tyrannical. They expressed those fears at a time when, compared to today, there was much greater natural conformity and fewer conflicting traditions in English society. Most of the conflicting moral traditions in English society were different denominations of Christianity. At the same time, as their conservative opponents and critics pointed out, society needs some level of unspoken and general agreement on a wide range of subjects. What is honesty, for instance, and when is it required? Or the society will simply function less well. Indeed, it is an underlying moral consensus that creates the society, producing it from a mere place where there would otherwise be an endless civil war between different religious come philosophical groups. Negotiating an understanding of what is the underlying moral consensus of a complex society is not a simple task. Maybe like painting the fourth bridge, it is a task that is never finished. And liberal education in particular has to fashion a general consensus that no one group feels to be tyrannical, but also that contains little that outrages the conscience of most citizens or public opinion with a capital P and O. That certainly cannot be achieved by a single system of state schools, even when the moral consensus it embodies is one rooted in tolerance. An instructive example here may be Horace Greeley's public schools in 19th century America. They performed the function of shaping a united American culture and a national personality from a culturally diverse group of immigrants. But the Catholic Church believed that one effect, maybe one aim, of the public schools was to raise a generation of good little Protestants. It therefore established its own school system. It was probably very fortunate that this separate Catholic system soon internalized the Protestant political values of Greeley's public schools and transformed the American Catholic Church along more liberal and patriotic lines. By the way, it incidentally transformed the Catholic Church outside of America too, as a result of the changes in the American Church. The dialogue between these two school systems both widened and strengthened the American system as a whole, proving it flexible when both public and religious schools are seen as the one system. The American people developed, therefore, a common culture, a national identity, and a sense of common destiny, but in ways that accommodated significant differences of public belief. That accommodation ultimately rested on a free market in religion and the absence of a state religion, and that was the result of a dialogue between two forms of Christian belief. Which brings me to the $64,000 question. Our current situation in America and Britain on the vital matter of transmitting our traditions, beliefs, customs, and indeed civilization to our children and future generations is a positively dire one. How can we protect this most important aim of a liberal education, not against a government alone, or a government that wants to inculcate a single set of political, social, and philosophical beliefs for the sake of social stability? That is at least an understandable aim. But against a revolutionary social and political movement that includes government and that wants to overturn our entire cultural inheritance and replace it with a compulsory utopian fantasy that seeks to build a new society on the basis of repudiating its entire past. That threat is at present a cloud no larger than a man's hand in Hungary and even Western Europe. But as President Macron is warned, wokeness, which is what I'm describing, wokeness is a disease that Europe must resist, especially when it threatens the transmission of our culture down the generations and therefore undermines European civilization's own sense of itself. To sum up, it can hardly be denied if these four aims of education still have merit, then our current educational systems are not really doing the right things. Without being too reductionist here, let me suggest that they suffer from several generic and obvious flaws. First, they are burdened by bureaucratic rules that have nothing to do with giving students a good education, but reflect past practice, unexamined social expectations, and sometimes damaging political ideologies. Second, they have no signposts pointing students towards the kind of studies that would either grip their imaginations or attract them on rational economic grounds. Indeed, many of the incentives for students that exist are perverse and point people in the wrong directions. Third, they are very uncertain in their handling of the virtue they cite most, namely diversity, whether it is diversity of religion, ethnicity, ability, or even diversity of taste. They are grounded in the belief that diverse outcomes are inequalities by nature and therefore unjust and to be avoided. That kind of instinct on the part of the educrats used until yesterday to incentivize them to oppose arrangements allowing for spontaneity, difference, or even specialization. The same instinct now incites them to prescribe a totalitarian system of education that denies science, repudiates religion, imposes uniformity, and punishes free thought and expression. So much for the flaws in our educational system. Gentlemen, the solutions, please.
Our distinguished guest is here. Thank you very much for this very eloquent and very thoughtful and profound keynote address. And I have a pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation, and who has been also a rector of a distinguished Catholic college in Wyoming, right? So my first question is that why we go on with a theme of common sense in education, and why common sense is important, if you can give us just a short definition of common sense.
Well, thanks for having me. Is this on? There it goes. Yes? Okay,
yeah,
there
okay,
we go.
It's good, working.
Good. I saw that it was on. I just want to make sure you were hearing it. Thanks for having me. It's a privilege to be here. This is my first time in Hungary, and I look forward to being back many, many times. Common sense, a short definition. You're asking a historian to give you a short definition of common sense. Common sense is what we know from nature. In other words, someone could be 5 years old or 10 years old, 15 years old, have no formal education, and it would be the knowledge we have that's been, as I would see it, imprinted on our soul, or if someone not of faith prefers, it's part of our nature, and that common sense is accentuated, it becomes deeper by our experiences with others. Also by our experiences with nature, our experiences with the outdoors. And the reason that common sense is in short supply, to paraphrase Voltaire, is because we have overcomplicated our human existence with social media, with an infatuation, especially in the United States, of 24-hour news, of things that may seem to be human, but really are not when you get to the core of what they are. All of those things get in the way of common sense. And dare I say, coming from someone who has a doctorate in American history, has been president of a college, who leads an academic institution, policy institution, that sometimes formal education gets in the way of common sense.
I would say that formal education, certainly because it's too abstract, it tends to be too abstract, it's in its way. But you are president of a very important foundation. So what kind of educational policies you will try to put forward that will influence the education in the schools, elementary schools, secondary schools, and perhaps also in a university? Perhaps in a university it's going to be a little bit too late, but let's say on a lower level. What kind of policies?
Thanks for that question. My experience with universities, more as a faculty member and as president of a small university, is that they are part of the problem. At least most of them are part of the problem, but I appreciate the policy question because it's what I do for a living. Let me say, though, that all of these policies need to be oriented around one goal, And we aim for this goal, we strive for this goal in the United States, but in particular, but in the West broadly, because too many institutions of learning, whether they be elementary schools, secondary schools, colleges and universities, have gotten in the way of families making the decision, the educational decision for their children, rather than the state making the decision. And I just want to hang on that point for a moment before I answer your question.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
One of the many lessons from the overwrought, unnecessary COVID lockdowns is that the radical left, especially in the United States, has revealed to us what their ultimate aim is. As I sit here with you, I can't believe that what I'm about to say is true, but it is 100% true. Mm-hmm. That when many millions of apolitical American parents, out of frustration with the lockdowns, out of frustration with the lack of transparency, out of horror as their kids are on video conferences with their teachers, seeing what they're learning or not learning, go to their school boards in the United States and express this frustration, they were met, this is the thing I can't believe is true, but is, they were met by the teachers' unions and their representatives at the local level with the following comment: those are not your kids, they're ours. That's the thing I can't believe the left has revealed. They've given us, who are education reformers, the greatest gift of our generation, the greatest gift, if we're willing to take it, in terms of policy reform that we will ever have, which is telling us what their aim is. And that is something that you in Central Europe know all too well, an infatuation with state power, centralized state power. And I'm sorry to report from your American friend that we have too many Americans becoming infatuated with that the children are the wards of the state, the intellectual wards of the state. This is directly related to common sense, of course. And so all of our policy prescriptions at the Heritage Foundation and in American conservatism broadly are focused on making sure that doesn't happen. And so first and foremost, what we call universal school choice. This pertains to grades K through 12 in the United States, where every single dollar that's allocated to students in the United States, mostly at the state level, but some of this money is at the federal level, at the national level, every single one of those dollars goes to the school of the parent's choice, rather than what we have in the United States, which is an allocation, an educational allocation by zip code, by
Sure.
very specific
by state
location.
and by
state and even more
county,
local than that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's a certain beauty to that as conservatives we appreciate, which is the beauty of the community. But ultimately, I can tell you from my educational experience, the quality of American education, by every objective measure, has only decreased as we've increased the amount of spending on education from the central government. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that a decreasing percentage of that funding actually goes to instruction.
Sure.
Instead, it goes to all of those things that violate common sense,
Yeah.
like diversity, equity, and inclusion, like critical race theory, and I could go on. You get the point. So universal school choice, the Heritage Foundation, just to spend 20 seconds to really amplify that point, is spending in the 8 figures. So between $10 and $20 million next year, 2023, in state legislative sessions. So this is at the state level to advance that objective. The second thing we are doing is amplifying the great success that Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida has had with the Parents' Bill of Rights. Yeah. And what I love about that idea, because it sounds very simple, obviously for us in the United States, we hear Bill of Rights, it's something that piques our interest, is that it's apolitical, it's not ideological, it speaks to our desire to be a self-governing people. What it does is reaffirm to the teachers' unions, to the school boards, that parents have a right to understand what their kids are being educated. They also have a right in government-funded schools to say what they don't want their kids to learn, and in particular, I'm talking about sex education. Yeah. The third thing, which I'll sum up with here, is a federal objective. And this is admittedly something that's in the realm of idealism at this point. But my colleagues at the Heritage Foundation have written the plan for this to happen, and that is to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. Ironically, the greatest threat to common sense in America is the U.S. Department of Education.
So it leads me to two questions. First of all, would you say that more emphasis should be placed on home education? That's my first question. And what are concretely those social forces that really weaken and even eradicate the common sense? You mentioned the diversity, inclusion, and equity, so equality. So could you expand on that? So the first, would you say that home education should gain in importance? Secondly, that what are those social forces that we have to identify and sound parents should fight against?
Well, you'll be accused of planting, I'll be accused of planting your first question because I'm a homeschool dad of 4.
Okay.
And in fact, we're in our 10th year of educating our 4 kids at home.
Sure.
Our oldest 2 went to the school that we started in Louisiana, but one is now in college, one is on the brink of college, so this has gone well, and of course my wife deserves most of the credit for that. The good thing about home education is that it reaffirms what we know from our intellectual tradition. For those of us who are faithful Christians, we know from our church tradition that parents are the first and primary educators of their children. This is what, of course, centralized power wants to undermine. So, and there's a very obvious philosophical, perhaps even religious point that many home educators are making. We certainly are. It's one of our objectives. The value of home education, whether it's faith-based or not faith-based, is that it's removing children from an environment that is explicitly designed to make children cogs in the machine. Mm-hmm. So even if we didn't have diversity, equity, inclusion, even if we didn't have critical race theory, even if we didn't have, in my adopted home state of Texas and the state capital of Austin and those local schools teaching sex ed to kindergartners, mm-hmm. even if that didn't exist, we still have in this Horace Mann style of government-funded schools in the United States an outdated mode of educating kids. And so it gives parents the opportunity to tailor the education to their kids' needs. And there are so many resources, including PhDs who teach middle and high school kids as they do ours. This is the value of technology. Your second question about, and I should say too, we have seen just since the beginning of COVID in the United States, the number of homeschool students double. So the percentage, probably by 2025, of homeschooled kids in the United States will be 10% of the school-aged population. This will have tremendous positive benefits for all the other kids and every other kind of school because of competition. The second point, very important point about social forces that undermine common sense, well, the first is groupthink. You know, our media platform at the Heritage Foundation has this wonderful motto that democracy dies in groupthink. And so to the extent that we can shun that in every form, and I don't just mean in terms of policy, I mean in terms of just our day-to-day interaction, shun groupthink, that's good. The second thing is, this will sound like an ideological point, but it's really a historical one. Just in my career as a historian and an educator, which has been full-time for 20 or 25 years, I have seen neo-Marxism emerge from just the corners of a faculty senate meeting, which I know as a historian at a public university, to being a predominant mode of thought, just sort of a base assumption by many people in power in the United States. And we need to be aware of that, not just because of the horrors of centralized power, but because one of the philosophical assumptions of Marxism, as you know all too well, is that it reduces human persons to their least common denominator, to the things that are immutable, like their skin color. And it creates, therefore, rotten fruit, all of which, of course, poisons common sense. And then the third thing I would say is, and I don't mean this to be an anti-technology screed,
Sure.
but the social forces in our Western democracies, republics, constitutional monarchies, all of which have given birth to a free market, the excesses of which can lead us to materialism, have created an infatuation, an obsession, dare I say, an addiction with screens, whether they be cell phones or televisions or larger computer monitors. That's a social force. That's a social pressure that, speaking as a parent, you have to fight, but it's worth the fight. And you can do so in a way, as Aristotle would remind us, in achieving the golden mean, of using it, but using it for a good end and not letting it become an end unto itself.
Yeah, and that leads me to two other questions. But before I ask those questions, if you would like to ask questions, I will please follow the indication which is on the screen. The first question I would ask is that I have experienced similar attitude of professors in my own university, and why they are so attracted to neo-Marxism. What is the attraction there? In my opinion, one of the essential aim is to eliminate everything that has been proposed valuable in the past. Also, so what is the attraction?
You could see my facial expression. I don't quite have the answer to that, but I've thought about it ever since I was a very outnumbered graduate student at a pretty liberal university in Texas, of all places. And I think, so you have as much wisdom on this as I do, I'm sure. I think the attraction to academic types is that Marxism, neo-Marxism, can become the ideological or the intellectual framework in which you can tear down power.
Yeah.
And I mean the following objectively, not at all derisively toward academics, including our academic colleagues who are leftists and who are Marxists. But in the West, people who have predominantly people who've been drawn into academic life, ironically, are financially secure. This is not, at least in the United States, the domain, and I'm generalizing here, there are exceptions, I would be an exception to what I'm about to say, it's generally the domain of people who don't have financial worries, and therefore, in the American context, have a certain hostility, ironically, toward the very basis by which working class Americans, of whom I was one, can become working up the ladder.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic. Yeah. It's ironic and it's strange,
sure.
But keep in mind, these are people who are attracted to Marxism. So
sure.
There's a certain lack of rationality.
And it's very interesting, the previous speaker alluded to the power as well. So, you were talking about Aristotle, but students and even high school students, they have to go into the society. They cannot stay at home, and they have to make judgments. So how can we nurture in them this ability to make good judgment, good practical judgment? I'm thinking about this Greek virtue of the phronesis, somebody who is cultured enough, but still able to make good practical judgment when it comes to even to find friends, to associate with friends, find a good sport club, or even find a college, or in any domain which has practical relevance on their lives.
Excellent question. Yeah, I've grappled with that question both as an academic, but also as a parent, and you'll hear the Burkean in me that we have to do in the West, especially, a really good job right now of being the little platoons of society. And so for especially middle school students, early teenagers, but particularly for high school students as they're approaching college, as parents at least, maybe as older siblings, as mentors, we need to help them form networks of friends or associates or acquaintances that are normal and healthy. I mean, we sort of goes back to my question about homeschooling. There's a certain retreat from society that homeschooling represents, but homeschooling at its best does that so it prepares these young people to go out into making the kinds of decisions you're talking about. I guess what it boils down to sum up here, is that we have to be available to younger people. For you and me, that would be most people who are here. For other people here who are younger than us, they're still younger people than you. We need to be available, thinking about Burke's comment about the little platoons, at being mentors, at being friends, at reestablishing the social and cultural associations that we have in our societies. And it's in that way that a kind of academic term becomes something we live out every day. And that academic term is institutional life or associational life. That sounds very heady, very intellectual, but in fact, It includes what we're doing now. It includes what happens when we step out those doors and encounter someone from the sidewalk. This is what we have to do in order to help people make those kinds of decisions.
I have received some excellent questions, so let me go to these questions. The first question I would like to quote is, eliminate Department of Education. What do you recommend instead?
Great question, thank you for it. What I recommend instead is that the 50 states run their own departments of education. And that's an easy response that's a little bit evasive, because then the appropriate follow-up question would be, and we've grappled with this question at Heritage, what do you do in the meantime? It's our goal to have the Department of Education eliminated by January 1st, 2030. And so we also adhere to the motto, the approach of radical incrementalism. So over the next few years, we need to start taking away pieces of that. The only part of the Department of Education that really needs to continue to exist are a couple of provisions from the 1960s laws on civil rights that guarantee equality and access. Those could easily be done by the Department of Justice in the same way that the Department of Justice, which isn't perfect, as you probably have read in the United States, oversees some of the state's implementation of election laws.
Sure. The next question is, universities are, and it goes together with the first question, universities are corrupted. Fine. What do you recommend instead?
Well, what I recommend is that the universities that are corrupt beyond reform be allowed to die, wither on the vine, and be kicked into the sea to make room for the new universities that not only will be founded, but that have been founded. In the United States, we have Hillsdale, Grove City, the new University of Austin, which is neither liberal nor conservative, but a neutral platform for faculty of all ideological backgrounds. Imagine that. I mean, that's the whole idea of a university, and that they believe in one truth, not your truth and my truth, or lowercase t truth, capital T truth. What's happening amid this civilizational ruin that's destroyed common sense is that enough people in the West have had enough, and they're investing their time, talent, and treasure in building these new institutions of higher learning. The difficulty is we're an impatient sort. And so we want to see all of these new institutions right now, but I'm convinced, especially if the trends hold, that by the end of the 2030s, so just 15 years from now or so, we will have so many new institutions of higher learning that it will render the places that are too far gone irrelevant.
Okay. Next question is, in a classroom, how can a good teacher advance the development of common sense, concretely?
That's an excellent question. I had to deal with that for a decade when I was headmaster of a kindergarten through 12th grade school in the United States, by encouraging students to ask questions. Mm-hmm. It's the single most important thing. Most of you are young enough to remember when all you did was ask questions. Your parents probably still, when you're there for dinner or talking to them on the phone, talk about those inquisitive times of yours. That comes from our nature. This is a good thing. It can be a little annoying when you're a parent and you have an inquisitive child who asks incessant questions. You know what those questions come from, or that desire to ask questions come from? Common sense. Trying to reconcile what they're seeing, hearing, smelling with what they're experiencing. And isn't it not coincidental that the very thing that Horace Mann's style of education in the United States roots out is the ability of the student to ask questions. Mm-hmm. And so a really good teacher, especially in the early grades, fosters in students that inquisitiveness that leads them to an understanding of deep truth.
Let's go back to the homeschooling. Is there a danger of homeschooling to lessen the social skills of the children who have to go out into the society?
I love that question because I used to think that was the case. When I first encountered homeschooling, it was with my brother-in-law's kids. And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't even know what homeschooling is. I'm an educator. This must be terrible. And then you know what happened? I spent time with them. And now, having known these youngsters their entire lives, they're in their late teens and 20s, I know that they're perfectly adjusted, normal students, normal people. And the reason is their parents did a very good job of not just educating them at home, but availing themselves of the opportunity to do things outside the home. Because the little known secret about homeschooling is that you can get the book learning done, the lessons done, in about 1/3 the time, maybe 1/2 the time it takes to complete those very same lessons in a larger setting. Because the nature of keeping a group of people oriented around the same set of goals is just hard. You know this from the classroom. And so good homeschooling parents use that additional time for individual pursuits. And I won't bore you with what our kids have done, but each of them has a couple of pursuits outside the home that actually, I think, has made them even better socially interacted.
Yeah. Would you be able to answer the next question? What are the differences between the American universities and the Hungarian universities? Would you have any insight into the Hungarian system, university system?
I don't have enough insight into the Hungarian system, but what I do have a lot of insight into is the American system, and I can tell you, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about the Hungarian contrast. The American system is under a very necessary and self-inflicted reform, and that reform is going to come from the top, from state-based leaders and from Congress, but it's really coming from the bottom, from students who are deciding they don't want to attend because the return on investment is so poor. I'd be curious to hear.
Well, I have, also, but I am coming from Canada, so I have less insight also into the Hungarian system, but I agree completely with you that the American system, the Canadian system needs a very profound improvement. What I would add to the previous reflections is that I would favor very much smaller universities. The larger universities are done. I think they are just became a big machine, and you're a cog in this machine. And liberal education, about which we heard earlier, can be much easier promoted in a smaller university. And culture can be nurtured also in a smaller university. We have to find these smaller colleges with 2,000, 2,500 students, where the students are not lost. There's a community of the scholars where they can collaborate and to create a much healthier environment. Would you agree with that?
I agree 100%. I think one of the non-political, and I would even say non-ideological aims of education reform ought to be sheer size. In fact, I have a lot of liberal friends from graduate school who not only agree with that statement, sure, but who have been part of building community schools for that very reason.
Yeah. The next question is a Socratic question. I would say Socrates would ask this question. What if the students are against the common sense? They would be against it.
Actually, yeah, that is a great Socratic question, and coming from this old Socratic facilitator, that's a really good question. Well, ironically, and I think this is how Socrates would want one of his students to respond,
sure,
is that's evidence of their common sense. It's actually in our human nature to come to know and love truth, but one of the ways to do so, underscoring the Socratic nature of this exchange, to question it. And to be in an environment where that questioning is allowed, but there are parameters to that question. So we actually ought to encourage that, but also encourage it not for the sake of just that question, but for the sake of what that question is really telling us, sure, which is that the student, child, adult is really thinking about big questions.
Next question is, can you give a concrete example of a good educational institute? Perhaps you can talk about your own. The Wyoming, sure, Catholic College,
sure,
right? Which
since you've given me that permission,
I suppose it's a good.
It is. I will.
And tell us about your difficulties that you encountered there.
Sure.
Okay.
There are a lot. K through 12, the United States, the Great Hearts Networks, the Hillsdale Classical Schools, Grove City College, Hillsdale College. All of that, so you don't think I'm just here to talk about the schools that I led. Wyoming Catholic College is distinctive in all universities in the world because of its commitment to classical education. There's one major, which is the liberal arts. There are no electives. Every student also spends 1 month when they arrive on campus in rural Wyoming in the Wind River Mountains, one of the most beautiful and remote mountain ranges in the United States, to come to know God's first book. And then one of the classes they take as freshmen is horsemanship, because we understand from Plato in particular, that wedding that real serious intellectual formation with a rigorous physical formation gets us to use a modern phrase, formation of the whole soul. So that is one school that has done a really good job, and its graduates, I think, are evidence of that.
Sure. In the opening speech, John O'Sullivan pointed out that education is somehow about producing gentlemen. How is the reproduction of elite in the United States?
Say the last part again.
How is the reproduction or the education of the elite in the United States?
Well, unfortunately, what has happened, this seems like it would be good, but this alone is not good. Colleges, especially those that are Ivy League oriented toward education of the elites, really are about professional networks, about getting a job. And that's good. We all want everyone to be gainfully employed, most of all, not for the money, but from the dignity that comes to the human person from good, honest work. The problem is that education is about much more than that. And one of the reasons that we don't have civil discourse in the United States, one of the reasons we have so few gentlemen and gentle ladies, is because our colleges and universities in particular have abandoned that approach to education, most of them have, and instead are focused on very short-term, very material things, which in and of themselves aren't bad. It's just that in and of themselves, they are not the aims to education. One of the things that makes me a gigantic optimist, in spite of all my realism today, about the future of American education is that every segment of American education that's growing by double-digit percentages year over year is classical, great books focused on getting back to the basics.
Yeah. Our time is up. I'm sorry I wasn't able to ask all the questions. Thank you very much for the keynote speaker as well as our guest. Thank you very much for your presence.